You know that moment when you accidentally walk in on someone in the bathroom? That split second of pure embarrassment where you just want to disappear? Well, what I'm about to tell you starts exactly like that, but it ends somewhere I never could have imagined. My name is Sarah. I'm 42 years old, and 3 months ago, I walked in on my 17-year-old, stepson Marcus, in our upstairs bathroom. What I saw in those few seconds didn't make me immediately slam the door and run away apologizing. No, what I saw made me freeze, made my blood run cold, and ultimately made me stay and confront something that would unravel a web of lies, pain, and secrets that had been festering in my home for years. Before I tell you what happened in that bathroom, you need to understand how we got here. You need to know about Marcus, about my husband Derek, about the family dynamic that had been slowly crumbling beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect suburban life. Because what I discovered wasn't just shocking in that moment, it was the missing piece to a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve. I married Derek 4 years ago. He was a widower, and Marcus was 13 at the time, still grieving the loss of his mother who had passed away from cancer 2 years before we met. I never tried to replace her, never even used the word mom around Marcus. I was Sarah, just Sarah, his dad's wife. And honestly, I thought that was enough. I thought we had a good relationship, all things considered. Marcus was quiet, polite, got decent grades. He spent a lot of time in his room, but what teenager doesn't, right? Derek traveled for work about twice a month, sometimes for a week at a time, so it was often just Marcus and me holding down the fort at home. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. The way Marcus would sometimes stare at nothing for long periods, his eyes unfocused and distant. How he always wore long sleeves, even in summer. The increasingly baggy clothes that swallowed his frame. How he'd skip dinners more and more frequently, claiming he'd eaten at a friend's house or wasn't hungry. The way he'd flinch sometimes when Derek raised his voice, even when Derek wasn't angry at him, but in the moment, living day to day, juggling my own work as a freelance graphic designer, managing a household, trying to be a good wife and a decent stepmother. These things just seemed like normal teenage behavior. Moody, distant, private. Normal, right? 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in July, Derek was in Seattle for a conference. Marcus was supposed to be at summer basketball camp, something Derek had signed him up for to keep him active and social. I was working from home, buried in a project for a demanding client, multiple coffee cups scattered across my desk. Around 11:30, I realized I desperately needed to use the bathroom. Our house has 2 bathrooms upstairs and a powder room downstairs. I'd been using the master bathroom all morning, but I'd just cleaned it the day before and had forgotten to replace the toilet paper. In my caffeine-fueled work trance, I didn't even think about it. I just automatically walked down the hall to the other upstairs bathroom, the one Marcus primarily used. I didn't knock. Why would I? Marcus was supposed to be at basketball camp. The house was supposed to be empty except for me. I just turned the handle and pushed the door open, already unbuttoning my jeans, my mind still half focused on the color palette I was working with for my client's project. And there he was. Marcus was standing in front of the mirror, shirtless, his back partially to me. But that's not what made me freeze. That's not what made every thought in my head screech to a halt like a car hitting a brick wall. His entire torso was covered in bruises. Dark purple and sickly yellow bruises in various stages of healing, scattered across his ribs, his back, his shoulders. But it wasn't just bruises. There were cuts too, some old and scabbed over, some fresher, thin lines that crisscrossed his arms and his sides. And in his right hand, catching the light from the bathroom window, was a razor blade. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, neither of us moved. We were both statues, frozen in a moment that would change everything. I could see his face in the mirror, his eyes wide with panic and shame, his mouth open in shock. My own reflection was barely visible behind him, but I imagine I looked equally horrified. Then reality crashed back in, and Marcus moved first. He dropped the razor blade into the sink, with a tiny metallic clink that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. His hands flew to cover his torso, grabbing for the t-shirt that was hanging on the towel rack, but his movements were panicked and uncoordinated, and the shirt fell to the floor instead. I should have left. Every social convention, every privacy boundary screamed at me to leave, to back out, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But my feet wouldn't move. My eyes wouldn't look away. And something deep in my chest, Some maternal instinct I didn't even know I possessed wouldn't let me run from what I was seeing. "Marcus," I said, and my voice came out as barely a whisper. What is this?" He finally managed to grab his shirt and pull it on, but he still wouldn't look at me directly. He stared at the floor, his whole body trembling, his face flushed with shame. "Get out," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, just get out." But I couldn't. I physically could not make myself leave that bathroom. Because in that moment, watching this boy, this kid I'd lived with for 4 years, standing there shaking and exposed and terrified, I finally understood. All those signs I'd missed, they all suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. I stepped fully into the bathroom and closed the door behind me, and I saw Marcus flinch at the sound of it clicking shut. "I'm not leaving," I said, and this time my voice was steadier, even though inside I was falling apart. "Not until you talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about," Marcus said quickly, too quickly. "I'm fine. I fell during basketball. The bruises are from basketball." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I could see him building the lie in real time, stacking it up like a wall between us, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I let him build that wall, if I accepted that lie and walked away, something terrible would happen. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The razor blade in the sink was still there, a tiny piece of metal that represented so much pain I could barely comprehend it. "Basketball didn't give you those bruises," I said quietly. "And basketball didn't put that razor in your hand." Something in Marcus's face crumbled. His jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut, and his whole body seemed to fold in on itself. He slid down against the bathroom wall until he was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. And then he started to cry. Not quiet, composed tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. I moved without thinking, sitting down on the cold tile floor next to him, not touching him but close enough that he'd know I was there. And I waited. I waited through the crying, through the shaking, through the moments when he'd try to stop and then start again. I waited because I knew that whatever was about to come out, whatever truth had been buried under years of silence, it needed time and space to emerge. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean in to hear him. "You can't tell my dad," he said. "Sarah, please, you can't tell my dad." And there it was, the first real clue. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what this meant. "Marcus, I need to understand what's happening. Please, help me understand." He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer, but then, slowly, haltingly, the story started to come out, and with every word my heart broke a little more. The bruises, Marcus told me, were from Derek, my husband, his father. They'd started about 6 months ago, shortly after Derek had been passed over for a promotion at work. It began with grabbing, fingers pressed hard into Marcus's arms when Derek was angry, hard enough to leave marks. Then it escalated to pushing, to shoving Marcus against walls, then to hitting. Punches to the torso where bruises wouldn't show, where Marcus could hide them under clothes. "But only when you're not here," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "He only does it when you're not home, or when you're asleep. He's careful. He makes sure it never shows. And he always apologizes after. He cries and says he's sorry, that he's stressed, that he doesn't mean it, that he just loses control sometimes." I felt like I was going to be sick. This man I'd been married to for 4 years, who I'd shared a bed with, who I'd built a life with, had been systematically abusing his son right under my nose. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I hated how my voice broke on the question. "Marcus, why didn't you say something?" He finally looked at me, and the expression in his eyes was so resigned, so defeated, that it physically hurt to see. "Because he's all I have left," Marcus said simply. "My mom is gone. My grandparents are gone. I don't have any siblings. If I tell someone, if Child Protective Services gets involved, what happens to me? I go into foster care. I get bounced around between strangers. At least here, I have a home. At least most of the time things are okay. And he really does feel bad after Sarah. I know he loves me. He's broken since Mom died. We're both broken. The rationalization, the justification, the way Marcus was protecting his abuser, it was textbook. I knew this intellectually. I'd read about it, seen it in movies and TV shows. But experiencing it in real life, hearing this kid defend the person who was hurting him, was completely different. It was heartbreaking in a way I had no reference for. What about the cuts? I asked, nodding toward his arms, toward the razor blade still sitting in the sink. Marcus, are you hurting yourself? He pulled his sleeves down even though they were already covering his arms. It helps, he said quietly. When everything feels like too much, when I feel like I'm going to explode, it helps. It gives me something to control when everything else is out of control. Cree. I wanted to hug him. I wanted to grab him and hold him and promise him that everything would be okay, that I would fix this, that I would protect him. But I didn't know if touch would be welcome, if it would help or make things worse, so I just sat there, my own tears now streaming down my face. We have to do something, I said. Marcus, this can't continue. This isn't okay. None of this is okay. If you tell anyone, it'll just make it worse, Marcus said. And there was real fear in his voice now. If you confront him, if you call the police, he'll know I told you. And when everything settles down, when everyone stops paying attention, it'll be even worse. Please, Sarah, please just forget you saw anything. I can handle it. I only have 1 more year until I'm 18, and then I can leave for college, and it won't matter anymore. Burka, 1 more year. 360 to 5 more days of living in fear, of hiding bruises, of cutting himself just to feel some sense of control. The thought of leaving him in this situation for 1 more year was unbearable. But the thought of making things worse, of inadvertently causing him more harm by acting without a plan, was equally terrifying. I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, and I waited until Marcus was looking at me, really looking at me. I am not going to forget what I saw. I am not going to pretend this isn't happening, but I also promise you that I won't do anything without talking to you first. We are going to figure this out together, okay? Not me making decisions for you, not me charging in and making everything worse. Together. But Marcus, you have to promise me something too. What? He asked warily. I pointed to the razor blade in the sink. No more of that. When you feel like you need to hurt yourself, you come find me. I don't care what time it is. I don't care what I'm doing. You come find me, and we'll figure out another way to get through it. Deal? Marcus looked skeptical. What if you're asleep? What if it's 3 in the morning? Berkey, then you wake me up, I said firmly. I mean it, Marcus. 3 in the morning, 3 afternoon, I don't care. You, come, find, me. He nodded slowly, not quite believing it, but willing to agree. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I promise. We sat there on that bathroom floor for another 20 minutes, talking in quiet voices about what would happen next. I told Marcus that I needed time to think, to research, to figure out the best way to handle this that would keep him safe. He told me more details about the abuse, about how it usually happened, about the patterns he'd noticed. Derek would typically explode after a bad day at work, after drinking a few beers, after a phone call with his own father, who was apparently a critical, harsh man who Derek could never please. The violence was never random, always predictable if you knew the signs. Finally, we both got up off the floor. Marcus looked exhausted, wrung out, like the act of finally telling someone had taken every ounce of energy he had. When does Dad get back? He asked. Not until Friday, I said. We have 3 days. Marcus nodded, then paused at the bathroom door. Sarah, he said, not looking at me. Thank you, for staying, for not running away, Eber. After he left, closing the door behind him, I finally allowed myself to completely break down. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried harder than I had in years, my whole body shaking with the weight of what I'd learned. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? What kind of person was I that I'd been living in a house where a child was being abused and I'd had no idea? But I couldn't afford to wallow in guilt. Marcus needed help, and I had 3 days before Derek came home to figure out what that help would look like. I picked up the razor blade from the sink, carefully wrapping it in toilet paper and throwing it away in the bathroom trash. Then I went downstairs, made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, and started researching. I spent the next 6 hours glued to my computer. I read articles about child abuse, about the signs I'd missed, about why victims don't report, about what happens when they do. I looked up the statistics, grim numbers that made my stomach turn. I read about the foster care system, about the reality that Marcus feared. I researched therapy options, legal options, safety planning. I joined online support groups for step-parents in crisis situations, reading through hundreds of posts from people who'd been in similar situations, trying to learn from their experiences. The picture that emerged was complicated. If I reported Derek to Child Protective Services or the police, there would be an investigation. Marcus would be interviewed, probably examined by a doctor. If they found evidence of abuse, Derek would likely be arrested. Marcus could potentially be removed from the home during the investigation, placed with a relative, if one was available, or into emergency foster care if not. A court case would follow, which could take months or even years. During all of this, Marcus would have to relive the trauma repeatedly, testifying about what his father had done to him. Or I could try to handle it privately. I could document everything, take pictures of Marcus's injuries, keep a detailed record. I could confront Derek and demand he get help, go to therapy, attend anger management. I could threaten to leave him if he ever touched Marcus again. But this approach was risky too. It left Marcus in the home with his abuser, relying on Derek's willingness to change and my ability to protect Marcus if he didn't. And statistically, abusers rarely stopped without external intervention and consequences. There was no good option. Every path forward had risks, had potential for things to go wrong, had the possibility of causing Marcus more harm. I felt paralyzed by the weight of the decision, terrified of choosing wrong. That evening I made dinner, chicken parmesan, one of the few meals I knew Marcus actually liked. I called up the stairs to let him know it was ready, half expecting him to say he wasn't hungry, to hide in his room like he usually did. But to my surprise, he came down. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us, and for the first time and maybe ever, we had a real conversation. Not the superficial "how was your day" small talk that usually characterized our interactions, but actual, honest communication. Marcus told me about school, about how he was struggling in his AP chemistry class, but too afraid to ask his dad for help with a tutor because Derek would see it as failure. He told me about his friend Jason, who he'd been slowly distancing himself from because Jason kept asking questions about the bruises he'd occasionally glimpse. He told me about how much he missed his mom, how he still sometimes forgot she was gone and would start to tell her about something before remembering. And I told him about my own life, things I'd never shared before, about how I'd grown up with an alcoholic father, how I understood what it was like to walk on eggshells, to constantly monitor someone else's mood, to feel responsible for keeping the peace, about how I'd promised myself I'd never end up in a situation like that again, and how betrayed I felt by the universe that I'd inadvertently married someone who was hurting a child, about how scared I was of making the wrong choice, but how determined I was to figure this out. "I've been doing some research," I said carefully as we cleared the dinner plates, "and I want to talk through some options with you, but not tonight. Tonight, I think we both just need to breathe, okay?" Marcus nodded, and I could see the relief on his face at the temporary reprieve. "Can we watch a movie or something?" he asked, and he sounded so young in that moment, so much like the 13-year-old kid he'd been when I first met him. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, we can definitely do that." We ended up on the couch watching some terrible action movie that neither of us paid much attention to. But it was nice, just being in the same space, not alone with our respective fears. Around 10, Marcus fell asleep, his head tilted at an awkward angle against the back of the couch. I grabbed a blanket from the hall closet and draped it over him, and he didn't even stir. I stayed up most of that night, alternating between watching him sleep and continuing my research on my laptop. I wanted to memorize this moment, this peaceful scene, before everything inevitably got more complicated. Because I'd made a decision, one I was pretty sure was the right one, even though it terrified me. I was going to confront Derek, but not blindly, not without preparation. I was going to document everything first. I was going to talk to a lawyer to understand my rights and Marcus's rights. I was going to talk to a therapist who specialized in trauma and abuse to understand the best way to support Marcus through whatever came next. And then, armed with information and a plan, I was going to tell my husband that I knew what he'd been doing, that it was going to stop immediately, and that if he ever laid a hand on Marcus again, I would destroy him. It was a risk, a huge risk. But the alternative, doing nothing, reporting it without giving Derek a chance to see the destruction he'd caused and choose to change, felt wrong too. I knew this might be naive. I knew that confronting abusers often didn't work, that they minimized and denied and deflected. But I also knew Derek, or at least I thought I did. I knew that, buried under whatever darkness had consumed him, there was a man who loved his son, who had been a good father once, and I had to at least try to reach that man before I brought the full weight of the legal system down on our family. The next morning, Wednesday, I woke Marcus up early. Over breakfast, I laid out my plan. I told him that I was going to spend the day gathering information and resources, that I was going to take pictures of his bruises and cuts if he'd let me, for documentation purposes, that I was going to talk to some professionals to understand our options better, and that tomorrow, Thursday, he and I were going to sit down and make a decision together about how to proceed. Marcus was quiet, picking at his cereal, processing. "What if we do all this and nothing changes?" he finally asked. "What if you confront him and he just gets better at hiding it, or he gets angry and it gets worse? Then we go to the police," I said firmly. "This isn't a one-time intervention and we hope for the best, Marcus. This is step 1. If it doesn't work, we have step 2, step 3, step 4. We keep going until you're safe. I promise you that." He looked at me, searching my face for any sign that I didn't mean it, that I would give up or get tired or decide it was too hard. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's do this." Brewer. We spent Wednesday morning doing something that felt surreal and awful. Marcus stood in the bathroom, the same bathroom where this had all started, and he took off his shirt. I used my phone to carefully photograph every bruise, every cut, every mark on his body. He explained which ones came from Derek and which ones he'd done to himself. I made notes with dates, as specific as Marcus could remember them. When we were done, we had a timeline of abuse spanning 6 months, documented in excruciating detail. Then I called a family lawyer, someone whose name I'd found through my research, and who offered a free initial consultation. I explained the situation, not using any names, just laying out the facts. The lawyer was kind but realistic. She explained that as a step-parent, I had very limited legal rights regarding Marcus. I couldn't make decisions about his welfare, couldn't remove him from the home, couldn't even legally prevent Derek from seeing him. My best options were either to convince Marcus to report the abuse himself, to report it myself, knowing that it might not be taken as seriously coming from me versus the victim, or to work with Derek to voluntarily get help. Next, I called a therapist, someone who specialized in adolescent trauma and family crisis situations. This conversation was longer, more nuanced. The therapist explained the psychological dynamics of abuse, why Marcus might be resistant to reporting, why he might even feel loyal to Derek despite everything. She talked about the concept of safety planning, about how to support someone who's being abused even if they're not ready to leave the situation yet. She gave me resources, hotline numbers, recommendations for trauma-focused therapy for Marcus when he was ready. Both the lawyer and the therapist said variations of the same thing. There was no perfect solution. Any choice I made would have consequences, some predictable and some not. The best I could do was make an informed decision based on Marcus's needs and wishes, while also recognizing that, as the adult who now knew about ongoing abuse, I had both legal and moral obligations to act. By Wednesday evening, I felt both more prepared and more terrified than I had before. I had information, I had resources, I had a plan, but I also had a clearer understanding of how high the stakes were, how easily things could go wrong. Marcus and I ordered pizza for dinner, neither of us in the mood to cook. As we ate, I walked him through everything I'd learned, all the options laid out in front of us. I was honest about the risks of each choice, about the fact that I couldn't guarantee any particular outcome. And then I asked him what he wanted to do. He was quiet for a long time, thinking. "If we report it, what happens to you?" he finally asked. "I mean, if Dad gets arrested, if there's a trial, what happens to your life?" The question caught me off guard. Here was this kid who was being abused, who was suffering, and he was worried about me. "That's not something you need to worry about," I said gently. "This isn't your responsibility, Marcus. None of this is your fault, and none of this is your problem to solve for the adults in your life. But it affects you," he persisted. "Your marriage, your life, everything. I don't want to destroy that." I reached across the table, and after making sure he saw it coming and didn't flinch away, I put my hand over his. "Marcus, listen to me. My marriage, my comfort, my convenience, none of that matters compared to your safety. Not even a little bit. If we need to burn everything down to keep you safe, then that's what we do. Do you understand?" He nodded, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "I don't want to report it," he said quietly. "Not yet, at least. I want to give him a chance. I know that probably sounds stupid. I know he doesn't deserve a chance. But he's my dad, Sarah. He's all I have left of my family. Can we try confronting him first? Can we see if he'll get help? And if he won't, or if things don't change, then we report it. It was what I'd been hoping he'd say, but also what I'd been afraid he'd say. Because it was the riskiest option, the one with the most potential to backfire spectacularly. But it was also Marcus's choice. And if there was one thing every expert I'd talked to had emphasized, it was the importance of giving victims agency and control over their own situations whenever possible. Okay, I said. We'll try it your way first. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. If at any point, even for a second, I think you're in immediate danger, all bets are off. I will call the police. I will get you out of here. Consequences be damned. Can you accept that? Briffy, yeah, he said. Yeah, I can accept that. Hey, bro. We spent the rest of Wednesday evening preparing for the confrontation with Derek. We talked through what we would say, how we would say it, what Derek's possible reactions might be, and how we'd respond to each. I printed out information about therapists who specialized in anger management and family counseling. I wrote down the names and numbers of support groups for people dealing with grief and stress. I wanted to have solutions ready, not just accusations. Thursday dragged by in a haze of anxiety. Derek wasn't coming home until Friday evening, but knowing the confrontation was less than 24 hours away made every minute feel weighted with dread. Marcus and I were both jumpy, distracted. I tried to work but ended up staring at my computer screen without actually seeing anything. Marcus went through the motions of his day, but I could see the fear in his eyes every time he looked at me that night around 2 a.m. I woke up to a soft knock on my bedroom door. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding, remembering my promise to Marcus. "Come in," I called quietly. The door opened, and Marcus stood there in the hallway, silhouetted by the nightlight we kept in the hall bathroom. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice small and young. "I keep thinking about tomorrow, about what might happen, and I can't stop my brain." I pulled back the covers on the other side of the bed, the side Derek usually slept on, but that was empty now. "Come here," I said. "It's okay." Marcus hesitated, and I could see him warring with himself, the teenager who was too old to need comfort fighting with the scared kid who desperately did. The kid won. He crossed the room and climbed into the bed, staying carefully on his side, maintaining space between us. We lay there in the dark, both staring at the ceiling. "Tell me about your mom," I said quietly. "What was she like?" And Marcus did. He told me about how she used to sing while she cooked, always off-key but never caring. About how she'd been a high school English teacher who could quote Shakespeare from memory and did so at inappropriate moments just to make him laugh. About how when he was little and had nightmares, she'd let him sleep in her bed and would make up elaborate stories about the adventures his nightmares were missing. About how even when she was sick, even at the very end when the cancer had ravaged her body, she'd found ways to smile, to make jokes, to make him feel like everything would somehow be okay. "She'd hate what he's doing," Marcus said, his voice catching. "She'd hate that he's like this now. She'd hate that I'm scared of him." "Brucey, then let's do this for her," I said. "Let's fight for the family she wanted you to have, the dad she loved, the life she hoped you'd get to live. She can't fight for you anymore, Marcus, but I can, and I will." We fell asleep like that, both of us in the same bed, both taking comfort in not being alone with our fears. And when I woke up Friday morning, Marcus was still there, curled up on his side, facing away from me, still asleep. I looked at this kid, this almost adult who shouldn't have had to deal with any of this, and I felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. He wasn't my son by blood, but in that moment, I understood that he was mine in every way that mattered. Derek's flight was supposed to land at 4 p.m, and he'd texted that he'd be home by 6. Marcus and I spent the day in a state of tense anticipation. I made us sandwiches for lunch that neither of us ate more than a few bites of. We tried watching TV but couldn't focus. Mostly we just waited, the clock ticking down to the moment when everything would change. At 5:30, I heard Derek's car pull into the driveway. My whole body tensed, and I saw Marcus go rigid on the couch next to me. "It's going to be okay," I said, more to convince myself than him. "We can do this." Derek came through the front door with his suitcase, looking tired but smiling. "Hey guys," he called out, in that jovial voice he always used when he first got home from trips, before the mask had a chance to slip. "I'm back. Man, Seattle traffic was a nightmare. How are things here?" Iburia. He walked into the living room, and I saw his smile falter slightly when he registered the tension in the air, the way Marcus and I were sitting stiffly on the couch, clearly waiting for him. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone shifting to something more guarded. "Everything okay?" "We need to talk," I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice was. "Sit down, Derek." He looked between us, his expression now fully wary. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What happened?" "Sit down," I repeated, more firmly this time. Derek sat in the armchair across from us, perched on the edge of the seat, ready to bolt or fight, I couldn't tell which. "What is this about?" he demanded. I looked at Marcus, giving him one last chance to back out, to change his mind. He met my eyes and gave a small nod. "This was happening. It's about the fact that you've been hitting your son," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "It's about the bruises Marcus has been hiding for 6 months. It's about the fact that you've been abusing a child, Derek. Your child." The color drained from Derek's face. For a moment he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then his eyes flicked to Marcus, and I saw panic there, and shame, and something that might have been fear. "I don't." "Marcus, what did you—" "That's not—" He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. "Don't lie," I said, cutting through his stammering. "Don't deny it, don't minimize it, don't make excuses. I've seen the bruises, Derek, I've seen the injuries. Marcus told me everything. So you have 2 choices right now. You can be honest, admit what you've done, and we can talk about what happens next. Or you can lie, and I can call the police right now and let them sort it out." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up, my thumb hovering over the screen. It was a bluff, sort of. I'd promised Marcus we'd try this first, but Derek didn't know that, and I needed him to understand I was serious. Derek's face crumpled. He buried his face in his hands and his shoulders started shaking. "Oh God," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." When he looked up, there were tears streaming down his face. "I know," he said brokenly. "I know what I've done. I know I'm a monster. I don't. I can't even explain it, Sarah. I can't explain how I let it get this bad." It wasn't a denial, it was a confession. And somehow that made it worse, because part of me had been hoping he'd have some explanation, some context that would make it make sense. But there was no context that could make this okay. There was no explanation that could justify hitting a child. "How could you?" I asked, and now my voice was shaking. "How could you hurt him, Derek? He's your son, he's a child, he's your child." "I don't know," Derek said, and he was sobbing now, his whole body shaking with it. "I don't know. After Lisa died, after I lost the promotion, everything just felt like too much. And I was so angry all the time. Angry at the world, angry at God for taking her, angry at myself for not being enough. And Marcus, he looks so much like her. And sometimes when I look at him, I just feel this rage that she's gone, and we're still here, and it's not fair, and I know that's insane. I know that's not his fault, but I couldn't stop it." Marcus had tears running down his face too, but he wasn't making a sound. He just sat there, listening to his father admit to the abuse, admit to the reasons, admit to the complete failure of parenthood that had defined the last 6 months of his life. "That's not a reason," I said coldly. "That's an excuse. Grief doesn't excuse abuse, Derek. Stress doesn't excuse abuse. Nothing excuses what you've done to him." "I know," Derek said miserably. "I know that. God, Sarah, I know that. Every time I hurt him, I hate myself. I tell myself it won't happen again, that I'll get it under control, that I'll be better. And then something happens, and I just snap, and by the time I realize what I'm doing, it's already done." I leaned forward, making sure Derek was looking at me, making sure he heard every word I was about to say. "It stops now," I said. "Today, right now, you will never lay a hand on Marcus again. Do you understand me? Never." "I won't," Derek said quickly. "I promise, Sarah. I swear to you. Never again." "I'm not finished," I said. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you're going to start looking for a therapist. Not just any therapist, a therapist who specializes in anger management and trauma. You're going to go to therapy, and you're going to do the work, and you're going to figure out how to be a human being who doesn't hurt people." Derek nodded frantically. "Yes, okay, I'll do that. I'll find someone tomorrow. And you and Marcus are going to do family therapy together, when Marcus is ready. You're going to listen to what you've put him through. You're going to hear about the damage you've caused, and you're going to work on repairing it for as long as it takes." "Anything," Derek said. "I'll do anything, and if you ever hurt him again, if you even look at him wrong, I'm calling the police." I have pictures, Derek. I have documentation. I have evidence. And I will use it to make sure you pay for what you've done. Do you understand? This is your only chance. There won't be another one. Derek looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. Maybe for the first time in months. Marcus, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve any of this. None of it was your fault. I love you so much, and I'm so sorry I made you afraid of me. Ibrahim Marcus didn't say anything. He just sat there, tears streaming down his face, looking at his father with an expression of such complicated pain and longing and fear that it hurt to witness. The conversation went on for another hour. Derek admitted to specific incidents, owned his actions in a way that seemed genuine. He talked about the stress he'd been under, the grief he hadn't processed, the way he'd been self-medicating with alcohol. He begged for forgiveness, promised to change, swore he'd do whatever it took to make things right. And through it all, Marcus sat silently, absorbing his father's words but offering nothing in return. Finally, I'd had enough. Derek, go sleep in the guest room tonight, I said. Give Marcus some space. Tomorrow, we'll figure out logistics, therapy, all of it. But tonight, I need you to leave him alone. Derek nodded and stood up, moving slowly like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. He paused at the doorway to the living room, looking back at Marcus. I love you, son, he said quietly. I know I have no right to say that after what I've done, but it's true, and I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to be the father you deserve, I promise. Marcus still didn't respond, and Derek finally left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he went up to the guest room. The moment Derek was gone, Marcus turned to me, and the floodgates opened. He sobbed like a child, all the tears he'd been holding back during the confrontation pouring out. I pulled him into a hug, and this time he didn't flinch or pull away. He just clung to me, crying into my shoulder, his whole body shaking. You were so brave, I whispered, holding him tight. So brave, Marcus. I'm so proud of you. I don't know if I can forgive him, Marcus said between sobs. I don't know if I can ever feel safe with him again. You don't have to decide that tonight, I told him. You don't have to decide that next week or next month. That's something you figure out over time, with help. And whatever you decide, that's okay. If you forgive him, that's okay. If you don't, that's also okay. There's no right answer here. Burger. We stayed like that for a long time, until Marcus's tears finally slowed, until his breathing evened out, until he pulled away with a shaky laugh. I got snot all over your shirt, he said, embarrassed. I have others, I said, smiling despite everything. Come on, let's get you some water and maybe some food. When was the last time either of us actually ate something? That night, Marcus slept in the guest bedroom, the one Derek wasn't in, because he didn't want to be alone, but also couldn't bring himself to sleep in his own room with Derek just down the hall. I gave him blankets and pillows, made sure he had his phone charger, told him to call for me if he needed anything. I barely slept that night. I lay in my bed, listening to the sounds of the house, hyper-aware where everyone was, ready to intervene if needed. My mind was racing, cycling through everything that had happened, everything that could still go wrong, everything that needed to happen next. The next morning, Saturday, felt surreal. Derek came downstairs looking haggard, like he hadn't slept either. Marcus stayed in his room. I made coffee, tried to eat some toast, and started making phone calls. I found 3 therapists who specialized in anger management and had experience with domestic violence perpetrators. I made Derek call all 3, leave messages, explain in basic terms what he was looking for. Then I found family therapists, people who worked with families in crisis. I made lists, gathered information, created a plan of action. Derek sat at the kitchen table, compliant, answering when spoken to, but mostly just existing in a fog of shame and regret. Over the next few weeks, things were tense but stable. Derek started individual therapy twice a week. He stopped drinking completely, poured every bottle in the house down the drain. He moved into the guest bedroom permanently, giving Marcus space and also creating physical distance that made everyone feel safer. He tiptoed around Marcus, overly cautious, overly careful, trying so hard to prove he'd changed that sometimes it felt performative. Marcus started therapy too, with a woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in adolescent trauma. At first, he was resistant, didn't want to talk, spent sessions in silence. But gradually, slowly, Dr. Chen broke through his walls. He started opening up about his mom, about his grief, about the abuse, about the self-harm, and slowly, very slowly, he started to heal. Family therapy was harder. The first few sessions were brutal. Marcus was angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him, finally letting himself feel the rage he'd been suppressing. He yelled at Derek, told him exactly how terrified he'd been, how betrayed he felt, how Derek had destroyed his sense of safety and security. And Derek took it, absorbed every word, cried and apologized, and didn't defend himself or make excuses. It's been 3 months now since that day in the bathroom. 3 months since everything changed, and I can't tell you that everything is perfect, because it's not. Marcus still has nightmares sometimes. He still flinches occasionally when someone moves too quickly near him. He still has scars on his arms, physical reminders of pain he inflicted on himself when the pain from others was too much to bear. But he hasn't cut himself again. Not once in 3 months. Because every time he felt the urge, he came and found me, just like he promised. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, sometimes in the middle of the day. And we'd talk. Or we'd go for a drive. Or we'd just sit together in silence until the urge passed. Derek has kept his promises too. He goes to therapy religiously. He's learned coping mechanisms for his anger. He's processed his grief over Lisa in healthier ways. He hasn't touched Marcus in anger since that night, hasn't even raised his voice. He's working on rebuilding trust, on being a safe person again, on being the father Marcus deserves. Marcus and Derek's relationship is different now. It probably always will be. There's a cautiousness to it, a fragility. But there's also honesty in a way there wasn't before. They talk more, real conversations about real things. Marcus is learning to set boundaries, to say no, to advocate for himself. Derek is learning to listen, to respect those boundaries, to earn back what he lost. As for me and Derek, our marriage is complicated. Some days I look at him and I remember the man I fell in love with, the man who was kind and funny and good. Other days I look at him and I see the man who hurt a child. And I don't know if I can ever fully forgive that or forget it. We're in couples therapy too, working through it, trying to figure out if we can rebuild what was broken. I don't know yet what the answer is, but I do know that whether Derek and I stay together or not, I'm not going anywhere when it comes to Marcus. He's stuck with me now. People ask me sometimes, if I had known what I'd find when I walked into that bathroom, would I still have opened the door? And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. Because that moment, as terrible as it was, as much as it shattered our family and forced us to confront horrible truths, it also saved Marcus's life. I genuinely believe that. The path he was on, the pain he was in, I don't think he would have survived much longer without intervention. Sometimes the worst moments are also the most important ones. Sometimes walking in on something you're not supposed to see is exactly what's meant to happen. Sometimes staying when every instinct tells you to run is the only choice that matters. I walked into that bathroom expecting nothing more complicated than an embarrassing mistake. What I found instead was a child in desperate need of help, a family in crisis, and a situation that demanded action. And in that moment, when I had to choose between respecting privacy and protecting a vulnerable person, between comfort and doing what was right, I chose to stay. And that choice, that decision to not look away, to not pretend I hadn't seen, to not prioritize my own discomfort over a child's safety, that's the choice that made all the difference. Not just for Marcus, but for all of us. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to turn away from someone else's pain. Even when it would be easier. Even when it changes everything. Even when you don't know if you can fix it. You just have to stay. And you have to try.